Welcome everyone to a YIVO Fellowship lecture. Today's lecture is in Polish Jewish Studies. Our lecturer today is Dr. Rochelle Grossman. And this lecture was funded by the Aleksander and Alicja Hertz Memorial Fellowship and the Samuel and Flora Weiss Research Fellowship in Polish Jewish Studies. Dr. Grossman is a specialist in Yiddish print culture and has recently completed a doctorate in comparative literature at Harvard University. Her article on publishing in post-war Poland was recently awarded the Panzer New Scholar Award by the Bibliographic Society of America. Her work on Yiddish in Mexico was awarded the 2020 UC Irvine New Horizons in Jewish Studies Prize and is forthcoming in the Comparative Literature Studies Journal. Rochelle's research has been supported by the Polish.
Thank the funders of this award. This fellowship has been extremely useful. Really, as was mentioned, I recently completed my PhD, and the resources of the YIVO Institute are chief among the important materials that I consulted, and I certainly would not have been able to do the research without this support. So thank you. So to jump in, today, I am going to analyze publications made in honor of Yod Peretz, and in particular in honor of his two significant Jubilee events that happened after the Holocaust. And this is going to be a way to look amply at how Yiddish cultural activists around the world were in conversation and in conflict with one another. This is going to be the framework for thinking about the demands put on Yiddish after the Holocaust and how different figures worked through them by way of publishing. And I'll just share that this is a section from a chapter, so it's just a fragment of a dissertation, which is much broader, that is really looking at the larger project of post-war Yiddish publishing overall. But I think that through this kind of truncated discussion, we'll be able to see that there are certain tensions arising among different activists within a global network. And this is sort of the foundation of the larger project that I hope we can talk about a bit more, perhaps during the question and answer period. So just to start off, of course, Peretz, Isaac Peretz, he is a very productive figure for thinking about these questions because of his centrality, both as the father of modern Jewish literature, which is what he's often referred to as, and of course, his close association with Polish Jewry specifically, and of course, with Yiddish. So Peretz was born in 1851 or 52. This is a contested date that we'll talk about a bit later. But he was born in Zamość, which is now in eastern Poland, and he died in 1915 in Warsaw. He was a towering figure, of course, in his own time, and he continued to exert influence over the development of modern Jewish culture long after his death. And so that we're going to look at his refashioning in some ways, or his treatment after the Holocaust, is a continuation in a lot of ways from how he was approached even in the interwar period, even before the Holocaust. And this is an important line of continuity. So today, we're going to look at the Peretz-Jahren, the Peretz years of 1945 and 1951-52, which are respectively the 30th yahrzeit of the writer, and then later his 100th birthday. Now, although there are only 6 years between these jubilees, there are surprising differences in how Peretz is presented during them. And this reflects the rapid changes to Jewish life and to Yiddish cultural production in these early post-war years. And as I mentioned, this framework also lets us look at the global spread of Yiddish publishing in this period. Because of Peretz's prominence, of course, cultural activists around the world really wanted to participate in honoring him by publishing new material for these Jubilee years. But as we can imagine, the conditions for publishing Yiddish after the Holocaust differ very dramatically if we're thinking about Europe right after the war, as opposed to Argentina, as opposed to the United States, for example. In these publications, we can see then not only changes in how Peretz was read and understood, but also how cultural activists position themselves within a changing literary network, where centers and peripheries are shifting, where different uses of capital and labor are available. And so these are some of the factors that will come to play in a lot of the things that we will see. So to begin, I want to think about the Jubilee as a really important literary event. And the way in which this kind of event is ostensibly about a writer, a venerated writer, a national figure in many ways, but it's also a flashpoint for larger debates about the nation or the group that celebrates the Jubilee itself. So this is something that extends far beyond Yiddish, but also includes Yiddish. These kinds of debates focus chiefly on the interweaving of politics and culture, and they're expressed often explicitly through the discussion of canon, and they use the figure of the writer and the writer's work to amplify ideal qualities and particular aspirations for the nation itself. And many scholars attribute the idea of a literary jubilee to the Shakespeare Jubilee of 1917, which really set the tone for European literature and really put this idea of the Jubilee as a huge event on the map. And just these are some images to show this the kind of material culture that results from some of these kinds of events. The ritual of the literary jubilee really came to be normative for European literature from Shakespeare on. And it was a real moment of national self-fashioning and even reckoning, as it was an occasion to honor a central national figure within this framework of identity. The event itself occasioned not only new debates on the works and the impact of the writer, but it also was a moment for animating a literary market and an entire print apparatus, as people wanted to contribute by reprinting the works of a particular writer. So we can see this, of course, in Yiddish literature as well, which draws from many examples in European letters, but also, interestingly, some Jewish ritual practices. So just to situate this conversation, these are two quotes from works that deal with a literary jubilee for Yiddish. Sonny Yudkov explains that within the Jewish cultural sphere, fans and publicists alike trafficked in jubilees. And we can see also from her research that it was not only Jewish writers that had central places of honor, of course, Sholem Aleichem, Peretz, Mendele, for example, but also Tolstoy and other writers who were part of the kind of world literature canon that was influencing Yiddish were also observed and celebrated by Yiddish and Hebrew writers as well, from Vilna to New York. And Anita Norwich really points out this interesting social and political ritual that is a mishmash in some ways of Jewish religious culture and European secular literary culture, which is the practice of observing a writer's yahrzeit. And Anita explains that the hagiographic evaluations of these writers following their deaths were the secular equivalent of the fervent outpourings after the deaths of Hasidic rabbis or spiritual leaders. And I think it's particularly fitting to think about that in terms of Peretz, because even in life, he was referred to as a secular Rebbe who cultivated a close circle of supporters. And in thinking of the material that we're going to see, there are a lot of ways in which he is being treated with a kind of yahrzeit, essay, a genre that is in one way cultural manifesto, but also elegy. And this is a way for those who are honoring Peretz to think about their own relationship to him, but also to the Yiddish world that he represented. So the 30th anniversary of Peretz's death is in 1945. And of course, we know this year to be so significant because of the way in which it really marks the beginning of the post-war period or the end of the Holocaust. And so this is a really important and unique confluence of events. So this Peretz year, the year of Peretz, it was discussed and anticipated by cultural activists, especially in the Americas, for at least a year in advance, even while war was still ongoing in Europe. And it gave people a way to think about, or to begin thinking about, a post-war world because of Peretz's close association with Polish Jewry and with Warsaw in particular. The Peretz Jubilee in 1945 was a particularly loaded event. And part of that was about how it marked a shift to a new era of reckoning with a devastating new reality. And we see in the image on the left, this is the former Jewish quarter of Warsaw completely destroyed. So in Poland, there is an immediate material and spiritual need of survivors and returning refugees. And in the Yiddish diaspora, there are new ascendant roles of cultural activists who are reacting to unfolding reports of devastation of the homeland that they've left behind. And there are a lot of efforts to send financial and material aid, to lobby their national governments to accept refugees, and to begin a memorial effort to come to terms with the loss of a homeland that they suffered at this distance. So this literary jubilee offered an opportunity to begin contemplating this new reality, in particular for Yiddish. What is the role of Yiddish in the face of this devastation? Can old modes of reading this kind of literature suffice, or do old stories resonate differently in such a changed context? And whose authority matters most in a transnational literary system where the centers have shifted? And this quote by Rachel Auerbach, I think, also really focuses on the changed material reality in Poland in particular, that where there once were thousands of books, in particular, the collected works of the classics of Peretz in particular, now there is, of course, this immense lack of reading material. And the books that are able to be salvaged have often been desecrated. So there is also this kind of parallel between the fate of the Jewish book and the fate of the Jewish people, which is a very symbolically loaded thing, which also the activists who rush to fill this void, they are contending with. Now, thinking about Rachel Auerbach as one of our figures today, she writes in the first issue of Das Neue Leben, which is the very first Yiddish newspaper published in liberated Poland. And she contributes, she contributes an essay in honor of the Peretz year. And this is a very interesting article for several reasons. The first is Rachel Auerbach herself and who she is as a figure. She is a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto. She's one of the few surviving members of the Onig Shabbos archives, an oral historian, a journalist. In the interwar period, she was very well connected with the Yiddish literary world. And after the war, her main objective is to gather testimony and to start thinking about this post-war reality and the immediate needs of survivors and those who are in Poland. And her article in honor of Peretz, which is 2 pages long, it appears in this publication, which itself was a miracle to print, because we can imagine that after the Holocaust, with the immense destruction of so many aspects of Jewish life, including the print apparatus, to be able to publish an 8-page newspaper is really quite a feat. And of those 8 pages, she gets 2 pages that she can dedicate to Peretz. And so this is also symbolically a very significant thing that Peretz has this great place of honor. And in her article, or essay rather, that she writes about Peretz. Amol is given a melech. Once there was a king. The king, of course, is Peretz. And like in this fairy tale, the song, this sort of lullaby, Amol is given a melech. There's a Jewish king. The king, in this case, is Peretz. His kingdom is Warsaw, and are Jewish letters. The kingdom is destroyed. And then what to do now? And essentially, Rachel Auerbach, she argues that the people who had so recently endured the most extraordinary things that human beings have ever endured on Earth, those survivors, they cannot be interested in the problems of a mad beggar or a bunch of Schweig, or concern itself with the question of whether Peretz wants to express his pity or contempt for Jewish figures. She, in some ways, directly opposes, then, attempts to honor the Peretz Jubilee with any kind of conventional literary debates that would rehash these kinds of questions, because she thinks that they're irrelevant in the face of genocide. What, she asks, can yesterday's debates mean now? So, in Auerbach's thinking, the post-war demands a new mode of reading, one that really breaks with the past, one that acknowledges the radical changes wrought by this destruction, and one that emphasizes national rebuilding and renewal. So, Peretz is not only a standing fragment connecting the ruins of Jewish Warsaw to its vibrant past, but he is also a source for this new chapter. Today, we must seek only that which will strengthen us, help set us on our feet again. And in the rich shelves of Peretz's library, will we find such curatives. So she really approaches Peretz with what she calls a, quote, practical approach to his creativity that simplifies him, universalizes him, focusing on his universalism and humanism, which the important thing to know about Peretz in this way is that he was claimed by many different factions, by Zionists and Bundists, by Hebraists, by Yiddishists, by lots of different groups, because his writing was very ample and in some ways contradictory. And this is part of what made him so dynamic, but also in this kind of conception of him, there's a real question about what should be understood. Is he, we'll find out later, is he going to be fitting for communists to take claim of him? Yes, in some ways, if you omit other parts of his writing. And what about his Hasidic stories? And so there are ways in which Auerbach wants to approach his entire work and then sort of flatten it and simplify it, because the more important thing to take away is not really the debates over abstract, aesthetic, ideological matters, but really this idea of rebuilding. And this is a much more important thing for her, facing actual survivors who are in the thick of it, in the ruins of Poland, trying to consider what a future might look like. Now, this is in contrast, of course, to those who are within this diasporic network. In the Americas in particular, we're going to see that are also rushing to fill the Yiddish literature gap. And the most dominant sites in this respect are Buenos Aires and New York. And they have these major material advantages, especially when compared to Europe, because these environments had been built up, in particular during the interwar period, and they'd not been damaged by the war. Those who are active in these environments experience the trauma of the war, of course, but also at a distance. So there's this interesting dynamic about how these cultural activists who did not experience the war firsthand approach this material differently than somebody like Rachel Auerbach, who is really there on the ground. And additionally, these other centers, they benefited from an influx of refugees who boosted local activities. And this led really to a shift in the dynamics of centers and peripheries in the global literary network for Yiddish. Now, we'll see here more about Argentina, but this quote that I have taken here from Avram Mittelberg and Wolf Bressler really, I think, represents a tone that was taken up by activists in Buenos Aires. The idea that the small and young Argentinian community has, thanks to the horrible Jewish extermination since August 1939, become one of the most important Jewish communities in the world. But this new status, of course, comes with an obligation, with schus, with this privilege. And the schus is the privilege, and they are choiv, they are obligated. And there's a sense that the presses that are emerging in Buenos Aires at the time and elsewhere in the Yiddish diaspora must do something in order to help the communities in Europe rebuild. And so in some way, they are ascendant because they have the material capacity to produce this material at a time when it's not possible to do it in Europe. And also the idea of war relief is not only in terms of the sort of quotidian, everyday kind of material needs, but also in this spiritual need for the Yiddish word. So getting into Peretz in this context, even as early as 1944, Yiddish presses in Buenos Aires and New York began planning the release of new Peretz sets. And as I mentioned, this writer was frequently invoked as a symbol of modern Yiddish culture, and printing new complete editions of his entire works demonstrated not only control over his whole body of literature and its presentation, but of course, by extension, this was a symbolic gesture to say that whoever could produce all of Peretz also had ownership over the Yiddish literary heritage that Peretz symbolized. So in Buenos Aires, Wolf Bressler and Avram Mittelberg established their own private press, Verlag Yiddish, the Spanish spelling of Yiddish. But of course, it's not YIVO standard, and also that is one way that this also appears. Their idea was to begin printing different sets of canonical Yiddish literature to send to Europe. And the most important thing is that they wanted to begin with Peretz, because when they rebuild their new Yiddish libraries, those in Europe are going to want to fill them out, especially with Peretz's work. And if we think about the infrastructure that is required to publish such books, they'll need type and paper and binding and finance and a local public and cultural activists who are knowledgeable. These are all things that are available in Buenos Aires. And in particular, this represents the kind of cultural capital that Bressler and Mittelberg are able to very quickly corral in 1944 in anticipation of producing these works for the Peretz Year of 1945. And they based their 18 volumes, which are shown on the right here, this blue book, they based them on Boris Kletzkin's version, which is on the left, which was sort of the definitive interwar collected works of Peretz. But they also made their own mark on it. And next slide, I'll show you a little bit about that. But in doing so, they are not only making their claims to Peretz, but also to Kletzkin, who was one of the most prominent and influential Yiddish publishers of the interwar period. So they are positioning themselves also as heirs to the Kletzkin project. Now, the 18 volumes of the Argentinian edition, they use the titles of the Kletzkin originals. They follow nearly the same order. So in some ways, they are reproducing this, but they are also including additional works attributed to Peretz that Kletzkin had not originally published, and in some ways, they had not been published in book form ever before. And in looking at these two pages side by side with the new version, the Verlag Yiddish on the right and Kletzkin on the left, we can also see some interesting and particular changes that they're making. So Mittelberg and Bressler, they modernize the spelling of the works following more or less a YIVO standard. They remove extraneous diacritical marks that were not fashionable any longer. They take out silent ions and hays that were part of this sort of Germanized orthography. And even though Kletskin's books were set by linotype, the letters in the Farlag Yiddish edition are fresh. So they're sharper and they're clearer and they're cleaner. And the Argentinian edition includes different sizes of texts and italics. And we can see this in this first page here from Giant Gruppes. They include this drop case, Svevov, as this additional flourish. And it gives this overall effect that this new edition preserves the integrity of the Kletskin text, but it presents a modern and easy to read reissuing of Peretz's original stories as befitting him for this very momentous Jubilee year. Now, in New York at the same time, Yiddish cultural activists of the CICO, the Central Yiddish Cultural Organization, they are also thinking about producing a Jubilee edition of Peretz's complete works. So this is still in 1944. The matter was raised actually during a meeting of their book publishing committee on October 12th, and these are from the minutes, which I was very pleased to find in the YIVO archives. As we can see from these minutes and from others that I referenced, they really wanted to produce these volumes, but there were some major disadvantages. First of all, the publishing committee was made aware that the Farlag Yiddish edition from Argentina was being produced and entering in circulation within the same literary market. And so they resolved to support these Argentinian efforts, actually, instead of creating their own rival volumes to send out to the same kinds of readers. They contacted Buenos Aires and they became distributors for these volumes in North America. And this is a very interesting moment of collaboration because the CICO Press very easily could have decided to part ways or do their own thing. And in fact, they continued to revisit the issue, even though they had resolved to partner with Argentina. Later in 1945, they revisited this question of producing something for the Peretz Jubilee, like a volume of collected works or a book for youth. But it was extremely difficult, and it was difficult mainly for financial reasons. And this is getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty, but I think it's very interesting to understand how material conditions affect very they affect the way that material comes to be printed and then consumed. And so essentially the cost of setting and printing even a modest anthology was financially prohibitive for CICO. CICO tried getting the Typesetters Union to donate either money or services, but even trying to argue that this would be a gift to European Jewry was not convincing enough. They approached donors in other cities, including CICO in Boston and Chicago, and nothing came from it. The Typesetters Union had been agitating from the 30s already for better wages, and printing costs were too exorbitant. And so this was sort of a very pessimistic moment for CICO in thinking about their contribution. But thankfully, technology was the answer. So in December 1945, there was this breakthrough that the technology of photo offset, also known as photolithography, had recently become more affordable for small presses, and it could really solve this typesetting cost problem. Now, the way this technology works is that instead of setting a book line by line with a linotype, this technology takes a picture of existing material, and then the image is transferred to a zinc plate for printing. And this would eliminate the need for this costly typesetting labor. It was a lot quicker. But at the same time, some on the CICO committee felt that on principle, when an organization like CICO wants to take on this task of issuing Peretz's work, it should be a new edition. And in part, that's because of a kind of concept of honor or on principle. But also many on the committee were critical of the Klutzkin edition. And this was what had logically been the idea for source material. But of course, this Argentinian edition also existed at that time, and it was widely acknowledged as being of excellent quality. So the proposal was floated to ask Verlag Yiddish in Buenos Aires for permission to reprint Peretz. And this was what ultimately happened. Now, in 1947, the first volumes of CICO's complete works begin to come out of New York. And as it happens, as an added boon, Verlag Yiddish had ceased operations after their Peretz volumes came out because Mittelberg and Bressler directed their efforts to other Yiddish publishing projects in Buenos Aires. So it just so happened at this exact time when CICO wanted to reprint these books, that there was still a lack of them on the market because Verlag Yiddish had folded. And so this was mutually advantageous for everybody to copy and continue to publish them so they could be on the book market. Still, it was not enough for CICO to simply reprint the Argentinian edition under their own name. Everybody wanted to make their own mark on Peretz's work. And so if you look at the two books together, which I was able to do at YIVO, we can really see the material differences. The paper and the binding of the CICO editions, they are much better. They are of higher quality, very sturdy. You can see even in these pictures I took that Verlag Yiddish is on this kind of yellowed paper, whereas CICO is still white many years later. Visually, they are almost identical, except for some very small changes CICO made to the ordering of the volumes. Now, as I mentioned, that the photo offset process requires an original, it is very difficult to make a lot of interventions in a text that is copied in this way. And so CICO used this edition. They praised the text for its clear orthography and being the most complete of existing editions. But they also found that it shared this major shortcoming, which was that they thought that the ordering of the stories was not correct. And so even though they couldn't intervene in the text itself, there was an effort made to make a mark on this entire set of Peretz's works by rearranging some of the individual stories and turning 18 volumes into 11 volumes and things like that. And in their own words, CICO maintained that their volumes put an end to the chaos that had plagued every other previous edition. So these are some of the kind of big statements made about the intervention going on with this text. But what is still interesting from a sort of dynamic of centers and peripheries is the way in which Argentina, which Buenos Aires had for so long been considered a kind of peripheral outpost, this central place for Yiddish in Latin America, of course, but always sort of subordinate to New York, how this particular publishing situation reverses this dynamic in which the Hertz editions out of Buenos Aires are great, and they are quick. They come out beautifully in all of these aspects of them, such that CICO needs to rely on them as their source, as their muster, as the original, in order to create their own editions, which, in spite of arguing that they are innovating on, they are in many ways simply reproducing. So this is a shift in dynamic where we really see the ascendance of Buenos Aires as a Yiddish publishing center. And it will continue to kind of repeat itself in other projects going forward from Buenos Aires out to the world. Now, the 1945 Hertz Jubilee was the central unifying event. In spite of these tensions, there are these aspects where this moment was an important moment for people to really mourn sort of collectively the losses of the Holocaust. But it was not always certain that 1945 was going to be such a big year. And you see in this article, Herman Frank sort of argues in favor of skipping the 45 Peretz so that everybody could focus on the 100th birthday. And his argument is that the Peretz 6 years later would give the entire Yiddish cultural world some time to reflect and to rebuild and to really do it right, to really honor Peretz. And by 1951, of course, the world had changed very dramatically, and there were particular implications for Yiddish. And of course, as I mentioned, there's some debate over the actual year of when the 100th birthday should be celebrated, making this Peretz actually a point of disagreement rather than unity. So in my last sort of 10 minutes here, I just want to look at a few examples of things done for the 100th birthday jubilee as like an interesting counterpoint to think about the use of Peretz by post-war Yiddish activists. Also thinking about the dynamic between Poland and diaspora and other things like that. So we'll return to Warsaw here. In Poland, conditions described by Rachel Auerbach from the ruins in 1945, they had changed dramatically in the intervening 6 years. Warsaw had been destroyed in most ways. And in these 6 years, it had been rebuilt as in most ways an entirely new city. And the design reflected competing ideological initiatives at its core. It was meant to represent and celebrate this new communist regime and this new country, the Polish People's Republic, the PRL. In the immediate post-war years, so in the late 40s, let's say, there had been approximately 300,000 Jews in Poland, and most of these were refugees who had returned from the Soviet Union. After the Kielce pogrom in 1946 and other violent anti-Semitic events, as well as a push to emigrate, there were many, many fewer Jews living in Poland in the 50s. And so this is an interesting dynamic in thinking about the potential of a future Jewish life in Poland from Auerbach's perspective to the perspective of the figures here pictured on the left. Now, by 1949, the communist government centralized Jewish institutional life, and this state intervention enabled, actually, interestingly, Yiddish literary production because the state supported the Yiddish Buch Verlag, the Yiddish Book Press, which was headed by particular Yiddish communist figures like David Svard, who's pictured here, as well as Beermark and Leib Olitsky, who are standing in the picture on the left in front of Peretz's Ohel in the 1940s. Now, most of these men had spent the war years in the Soviet Union, actually, where they were refugees, and they returned to Poland to really help build this new state, in particular to build it from the perspective of what Yiddish could offer in thinking of a secular Jewish identity. And so this is an interesting tension that's building, because in the same years that the Yiddish press was getting established, the state was negotiating its relationship to the Soviet Union, and Poland was under Soviet influence, but not Soviet. And this kind of tension extended even to Yiddish literary production. So these figures who had been in the Soviet Union, they returned to Poland, some of them not disenchanted with communism per se, but really with Soviet communism specifically. But it was a kind of difficult relationship because the Yiddish Book Press and the publishing endeavors by these figures gave an outlet to Soviet Jewish Yiddish writers who were not able to publish in those times. And also there was a way in which ideologically they wanted to publish things that were in favor of Soviet ideology, especially under Stalinism. So these two books here are helping to think about the Yiddish book treatment of Peretz in honor of the 100th birthday, because this is a unique moment of Polish-Soviet Yiddish collaboration that reflects this tension. Then, so the books on the left is by Der Emes, which was Moscow-based Yiddish publisher. These were published in 1941. And on the right is the Yiddish Buch Verlag edition, published in Warsaw in 1951. So what is particularly interesting about the presence of these volumes in general is that although Peretz's prominence throughout the Yiddish world was undisputed, his reception in the Soviet Union was pretty complicated. So as a lot of scholars have written, including Dalia Kaufman, Peretz's reception in the Soviet Union and through Soviet criticism had a few different periods. So in the 20s, there was no clear ideological line. In the 30s, Peretz became regarded as ideological reactionary. And then in 1941, this is during the war, there is this edition that comes out to honor Peretz through an important jubilee. And this is in particular in response to the results of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when the Soviet Union was able to claim parts of Eastern Poland. And suddenly, there are a lot of new Yiddish-speaking Polish Jews that are part of the Soviet Union for this very brief time period. And during this time, this books come out as a way to celebrate Polish Jewry, which is now part of Soviet Jewry. And these books are super rare because they were a very short-lived project and honestly mostly forgotten, but they serve as source material for the Yiddish book editions, which come out 10 years later. And as I just mentioned, in thinking about the politics of the reprint, it's not just regular source material because they needed something to use. In fact, looking at a particular volume and using it as the original says a lot about the dynamic between the two presses, contexts, and ideologies. So the 1951 Polish reprint looks at the material that's put in the Soviet edition and reproduces it, but also includes a new essay by Mark that really emphasizes the intense Polish character of Yudlam and Peretz. Now, both introductions, there's an introduction in both by Rivka Rubin, which is just reproduced, and she's a Soviet literary critic for Yiddish. And her evaluation of Peretz is very ideological, casting him as more of a communist, thinking about his contributions of Bonche Schweig, things that were sort of against the agitating for revolution, these kinds of things. But the very intense way in which Mark casts Peretz as a Polish Jew is part of casting himself also as part of the Peretz tradition, that he and his fellow Yiddish communists in Warsaw, in the PRL, that they are following in Peretz's footsteps, not only because they are dedicated to Yiddish letters, but because they're also dedicated to Yiddish communal work. And so these are the ideological contours of these two books. And then materially, unlike the Zico and the Farlag Yiddish, this sort of dynamic, these books are not actually copies in that sense, that the Peretz edition that comes out in Poland in 51 is of a more standard, more Yivo familiar style than the Soviet edition, which follows Soviet orthography. And this is really important because one major way that the Yiddish Buch Press maintained its identity as a distinct, though communist, Yiddish endeavor was that they did not adopt this orthography. And in fact, they reset the entire book so that they could make interventions on the text in that way. So these are some of the interesting aspects of the identity that come through here. Now, I feel that time permitting, I'm not able to get into some of the very last examples, but I just want to briefly mention that, of course, there are other things happening in the Yiddish world, getting into 1951-52. Most, perhaps importantly, is the founding of the State of Israel, and Avram Sutzkever's The Golden the Kate journal, which has its own Peretz number 10, that comes out in honor of this jubilee. And this this journal, as well as other books, for example, by Nachman Meisel in New York, they represent a return to Peretz Forschung, to Peretz research, that whereas in 1945, the stakes of the conversation around Peretz were about mourning the loss of Polish Jewry, as Peretz could be a cipher for those thoughts and ideas. 6 years later, a lot of the conversation has returned to those debates that Auerbach dismissed as being so irrelevant. And so there's a way in which there's a continuity, but also a refashioning of the Yiddish literary sphere after this big events. So I am going to sort of leave it there, just to mention that this is a very tumultuous time period for Yiddish, in which these individual actors, who are these cultural figures at the heads of these presses, are using their publishing activities as a way to debate with one another over who is ascendant, who has the most authority, but also what is the true existential purpose of this work, and what is the future of Yiddish, by thinking about what the past can tell them as they work through it. So thank you, and I hope we can have an interesting conversation during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. That was really a fascinating look at how Peretz becomes this avatar for Jews in a variety of different centers, in order to memorialize this horrible tragedy that's just taken place. So I have a couple of questions. I guess we'll start with those. I'm curious to know what the reception to all of these different volumes was in these different places. How did readers take them? Also in connection to that, what were the print runs of these like? Obviously in the United States, Yiddish publishing or the Yiddish readership had been reduced by assimilation. I assume it had been elsewhere. I'm just curious about those, those aspects. Feel free.
Yeah, these are excellent questions. The reception question has vexed me throughout all of this research, because it is difficult to get a true sense of the actual readership of a lot of post-war materials, in the sense that there's just this proliferation of Yiddish books that are being made and produced, whether or not anybody reads them, because of the ways in which they are funded by either philanthropy or the state. So there's not a clear one-to-one kind of market, as we might think about having somebody needs to buy the book in order for more books to be produced. So that's sort of a disclaimer. However, it is the case that a lot of these books did make it to Europe, and they did fill a lot of these libraries as intended. It was remarkable. I was in Wrocław last summer, and I found a library catalog from the Wrocław, maybe it was called the Folks Library, maybe it was even named for Peretz, but they are there, all of these volumes that had been produced precisely for these kinds of institutions. And as a library, then we have to assume that there were multiple readers, because people were able to, check out books and share them. And so this is sort of initially in the post-war moment. I would say that there are quite a few readers. There is a demand. There is an interest. Print runs, of course, are never getting too big. I think 5,000 is a pretty average number. But as I mentioned, when Verlag Yiddish sort of goes out of business, they leave a demand, actually, that people still want these books. And so Zico is actually filling a need in the market by reprinting these new editions. And they're sent everywhere. They were sent not just to Europe, but to Argentina and South Africa and Israel, and essentially wherever there were readers who were interested in these materials, that's where they went, because there hadn't been new definitive editions of Peretz since Kletzkin in the 1920s. So even from that perspective, it had been 20 years, more than that. So there was also this kind of demand.
Right. And one of the interesting things that you bring up is that these things are taking place in these different centers of Yiddish culture: New York, Buenos Aires, Moscow, and in Poland. One aspect of this is, I think often people don't really consider Buenos Aires to be this kind of important cultural center. And I can just note that behind you is this really incredible series of books called Das Polnische Judentum, which was printed in Buenos Aires. And it's an absolutely phenomenal series, that also commemorates Polish Jewry. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, about just the role of Buenos Aires in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, so part of the interesting aspect of the Buenos Aires Yiddish literary production environment is the way in which everybody is very closely connected and also has intense rivalries. So Mittelberg and Bressler, these guys who create these Peretz volumes, the reason they fold or they end their private project is that they get involved with a figure called Mark Turkov, who wants to create this immense series, Das Polnische Judentum. So they drop this Peretz project, or this canon creating project, which was already envisioned to be something so big, and they join up with someone else who also has immense amounts of cultural capital to create this even larger project that is going to commemorate and memorialize Polish Jewry. From this dynamic, as you mentioned, that Buenos Aires is sort of an ascendant place in this global network. People are writing memoirs and sending all sorts of things to Argentina to be published in the series. Then from Argentina, these books are being sent back out into the world. So this is a refashioning of this dynamic. And it's not only these three guys. So there are also other figures trying to get in on it, I'll say. So there's Shmuel Rojansky, who creates this Musterwerk series, which is 100 volumes of what he deemed to be the most important things you should have on your shelf. And just the post-war period, as I see it, is already defined by this massive sense of creating huge works. So encyclopedias and lexica and series, that this idea that you can contain Yiddish in a book, or you can contain Yiddish culture or Polish Jewish culture or some kind of vague thing, and you can put it on your shelf and then it won't go anywhere, or it won't die, or you've saved it, or there's some kind of way in which there's a material mark you're making on this thing that would otherwise disappear. And we see this so often in the production of books and things that are coming particularly out of Buenos Aires. I think because that is really where most things are being printed, even if they're being written, let's say, in New York or in Tel Aviv or something, and even read also in New York and Tel Aviv. They might be printed in Buenos Aires, assembled there too. So this is an interesting dynamic.
Right. Is that a financial consideration, or?
Yeah, I think primarily financial. I mean, maybe not primarily, but definitely, as we see with the Zico volumes and this idea of the typesetters union becoming, I would not say they were too powerful, but they are asking for more money and there is no money or whatever. And in Argentina, there are different kinds of financial considerations. And so that's part of it. Also, in Buenos Aires, there is a really robust infrastructure for creating these things, because even though in the interwar period, a lot of the production in Buenos Aires is for a local audience, there is a lot of effort being put into creating presses and the print shops, and also the particular figures. A lot of these guys who become so prominent in the post-war, they immigrated to Buenos Aires in the 30s. And so they bring with them also a lot of their connections and their knowledge and things like that.
Fascinating. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and if anyone does have any more questions, please put them in the Q&A section. David Goldstein asks, how safe was Yiddish publishing in Poland after the Holocaust? Didn't threats against Jews continue even after World War II ended in Poland, as you mentioned with the example of the Kielce pogrom?
Mm-hmm. So this is an excellent question, because it gets also at the dynamics of sort of state power and its intervention, particularly in Poland. In the very, very immediate post-war years, so between 45 to, let's say, 49, there is kind of a diversity of ideology represented among different Yiddish writers and journalists who are in Poland. And they share a lot of resources. They're based in Łódź mostly. That's where they were able to sort of put together different sets of Yiddish type, and there's a linotype. And so materially, this is the place. And people are able to start printing things, in particular testimonies, Holocaust, very, very early works of Holocaust literature, these kinds of things. And Das Neue Leben, this newspaper. In terms of safety in those years, it seems that there was a limited readership, mostly to local Polish Jews. And it wasn't, it wasn't so dangerous in an immediate way. People weren't necessarily knocking down doors to burn the presses or anything like that. But certainly after 1949, when the communist regime took power, this was a moment in which those who were not ideologically committed or compatible with the regime, they were in most ways forced out. And Rachel Auerbach herself, she leaves in maybe 1951. She moves to Israel. And this is sort of, in one way, it's a very nice thing that the state supports Yiddish publishing, because it enables so many interesting things to be made at a time when that seems pretty unlikely. But also, not even thinking about actual state censorship, but the implication that in order to produce this stuff, you have to agree with the state because you have to be part of the in-group that is creating the materials. These are sort of the, I think, more structural kinds of, we could say, violence that's made against Yiddish production in Poland in this period. So those, I would say, were the main things limiting or affecting Yiddish publishing after the Holocaust in Poland in that way. Though, I don't know, I feel like there's some disclaimers, because it's not in the Soviet Union, of course, in these years, there's actual real violence happening against Yiddish poets and writers and purges. And this is not the same in Poland. So these are sort of drastic differences between these environments.
Right. Just one interesting note is, you mentioned that it was kind of nice to have the state support this type of publishing. In this same period, you have an actual Jewish state that doesn't support this type of publishing. And it's, done privately through, Avram Sutzkever and the Golden Kate. So there's that interesting kind of irony there. All right, we have one last question, and it's a little bit of field, but maybe you can provide an answer to is from Tara Newworth. Can you speak to the current interest or quote unquote revival of Yiddish in Poland and any related Yiddish publication activity?
Yes, I will try. I can only speak from personal experience, as I was living there for a few years. I'll just say, this is an interesting question. It's a bit complicated, I'd say, but there is quite a bit of interest in Yiddish, in Jewish culture, in Jewish Polish culture, among certain groups in Poland. I think that of the scholars that I know, a lot of it hinges on this idea that Polish history is not complete, or you can't understand it completely unless you also understand Jewish history, that these are entwined. And Yiddish is a really significant aspect of the Jewish story in Poland. So that's an aspect of it. I think in some ways we see echoes of this idea of, Peretz is this avatar of Polish Jewish identity, and that Polish and Jewish are sort of mishmashed. There are very many excellent programs now in Poland that are doing good work about Jewish history and literature and these kinds of things in Poland. And I'd say sort of politically, if we think about, let's say, Olga Tokarczuk and her new book, Books of Jacob, or that she won the Nobel Prize, just sort of this more diffuse general attitude about Jewish history in Poland as being also a way to think about alternative narratives that are not so monoethnic, and as a way, in some ways, to kind of challenge the state and the current political situation in Poland that is fixated on telling narratives that are primarily about ethnic Poles, Catholic Poles, and this kind of single story. And so in some ways, interest in the Jewish aspects of Poland challenge that. So I will leave that there, but there is quite a lot to see and to understand and to like about Poland today, in particular, the things that are happening for Jewish life.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Dr. Rochelle Grossman, the YIVO Polish Jewish Studies Fellow of 2022 to 2023, for this fascinating lecture. Again, this lecture was funded by the Aleksander and Alicja Hertz Memorial Fellowship and the Samuel and Flora Weiss Research Fellowship in Polish Jewish Studies. If you liked what you saw, please consider making a donation to YIVO. We can't bring you these lectures, and we can't help support scholars like Dr. Grossman without your support. So thank you so much, and we will see you at the next lecture.
Thank you.